Hello, I'm Mike, founder of Starlit Contracts, where we help you to negotiate and use contracts with confidence. This video is part of our Build the Foundation in Contracts program, and our topic is boilerplate clauses. To summarize, boilerplate clauses are a category of clause that you're going to find in the contract. Now, I've never seen a contract which had a section highlighted as boilerplate clause. Rather, the term is supposed to identify those clauses which you will find in many different types of contract all over the world in a very similar format. So examples of that can be a confidentiality clause, force majeure, or even the notifications clause. So how does it work in practice? Well, contracts are typically divided into boilerplate clauses and project-specific clauses. And the thing with a boilerplate clause is because they've been used so frequently and they've been processed through the courts and other forms of dispute resolution, it's clearer for the parties how that kind of clause is going to be applied in practice if it is ever needed. Should you care? Well, a bit like all clauses, it really depends on whether or not you're going to need that clause. But typically, it doesn't do you any harm. It doesn't worsen your risk profile. It tends to just more clearly illustrate how the parties want to deal with a certain issue. Now keep in mind that if you were to remove a boilerplate clause during the negotiation period and then you want to introduce that clause later through a contract amendment, that could be a lot harder. You're not necessarily going to be able to do that unless the other party agrees to it. Let's look at a practical example together now. Steve removed the boilerplate confidentiality clause from his contract template to make it shorter. I should highlight that this is a very common motivation. People feel that by shortening the contract, they'll make the entire contracting process much easier and reduce the complexity of the deal overall. But let's see what happens. He signed a contract with the customer, then realized that he needs to send the customer sensitive information to complete his obligations. Steve does not want the customer to share it. So what could go right for Steve in this situation? Well, potentially he would go and speak with the customer and explain what the situation is. And if that customer is willing to accommodate his request, potentially they might say, okay, well, we can amend the contract between us in order to include a confidentiality clause. And the customer agrees that they can receive that sensitive information, use it for the purpose described in the agreement, but not transfer it to any third party. Or potentially Steve and the customer might reach some agreement that in fact Steve can perform his contractual obligations but not disclose the sensitive information. Potentially there's another way of addressing his performance obligations in the agreement. But what could go wrong for Steve in this situation? Well, let's say that the customer is not being accommodating, is not looking to find a solution. The customer might even say to Steve, well, hang on, Steve, what you're supposed to send to us is very clearly stated in the contract, and we understood that we would be able to use that information in the way that we deem fit, because there's nothing prohibiting us from doing that in the agreement. So Steve, if you don't send us that information, you're going to be in breach of contract and we can pursue a claim against you. Let's look at some key considerations in relation to boilerplate clauses now. And the first point to consider is, do you really need that boilerplate clause? Because think about these two different scenarios. One might be, you're a supplier, you've got an online shop, customers come to your shop, and if they want to purchase your product, they can download it and pay immediately. Now this is a very different situation to a supplier who would go to a customer's site and perform maintenance over the period of, say, a year. Now between these two different scenarios, the benefit of a force majeure clause would be different. Now a force majeure clause is designed to give relief to a supplier and sometimes also a customer if there's a force majeure event, such as an act of God or flooding or a war, something like that. So between these two scenarios, you might think in the first, the benefit of a force majeure clause isn't that great. I potentially prefer to have a shorter form terms and conditions, but in the latter clause, I really would prefer to have it. But when making your decision on this topic, also consider about your future relationship with that contract party. because the contracting process, it can be a bit tricky at times. It can be a bit of effort which people are not so familiar with. So the temptation is for contract parties when they enter into deals later that they want to reuse the terms and conditions that they've previously agreed. So when you are signing, especially your first contract, think about how might your relationship with that party change over time. Could it be that the scope of work will evolve to include different products or different services? Then consider, does this boilerplate clause potentially benefit me in future for those type of deals? If that's the case, it might be easier for you to just include that boilerplate clause in the first contract that you enter into with the other party. Finally, whilst boilerplate clauses can be very important to a deal, it is important that you spend the majority of your time during negotiations in the topics that are most important to your deal. Now, they will often be in relation to the scope of work, or to the payment mechanism, or to topics like the cap on liability and exclusions of liability. I hope you found this introductory content helpful, but if you're ready for the next step to learn how to negotiate and use contracts with confidence, then check out our website starlitcontracts.com, where you can become a member to access additional content, interactive sessions, and be part of our community. I look forward to seeing you there.